James Alcott had everything money could buy. Sprawling estate nestled in the leafy suburbs of Westchester County, a penthouse in Manhattan, 2 beach homes, one in the Hamptons, the other in Malabahand, an empire built on software patents that still raked in millions every quarter. At 42, he was the CEO of a Fortune 100 tech firm and graced magazine covers more often than he'd ever wanted. But all that wealth, power, and prestige couldn't fill the void that had hollowed him out from the inside since the day his wife, Isabel, passed away. Isabel had been the heart of everything. When cancer stole her away 3 years ago, it didn't just break James, it broke time. Moments blurred together. Conversations passed through him like air. The house, once alive with Isabel's laughter and little Emma's squeals, now felt like an empty museum curated by housekeepers and security guards. The only thing that tethered James to this world anymore was his daughter. And Clara Hughes had come into their lives quietly, like a soft breeze on a still day. Petite and modestly dressed, with warm brown eyes and a voice so soothing it could calm even the most distressed toddler. She'd shown up for the Nanny interview with no arrogance or desperate eagerness, just calm, kind resolve. Emma had taken to her instantly. It hadn't been the enthusiastic kind of affection, but the deep, trusting bond that forms when a child senses genuine safety. Within a month, James noticed something else. Emma was laughing, again, reading books, painting again. And every evening Clara left at exactly 6 p.m. She never lingered, never asked for favors, never took up space she wasn't invited into. She simply gave her best to Emma and disappeared into the city as quickly as she came. James had, admittedly, paid her little attention. He was polite, professional, sometimes distant, not because he disliked her, but because he'd forgotten how to open the emotional gates. That was until one rainy Thursday in early November, and something shifted. The day had started like any other calls. Meetings, numbers, more meetings. James barely noticed the gray drizzle outside until he glanced up from his office window and saw Clara hurrying down the driveway. Her umbrella was broken, clutched awkwardly to one side, and her cardigan soaked, but she didn't stop to adjust it. She simply jogged toward her old Corolla parked near the gates and disappeared. Something about it stuck with him. Maybe it was the way she glanced over her shoulder as if checking that no one saw her, or the way Emma, moments after Clara left, sat quietly at the window, staring at the raindrops. Where does Clara go every day? Emma asked that evening over dinner. James paused, surprised. At home, I guess. She has lots of homes, Emma said, not looking up from her mashed potatoes. Sometimes I think she lives in magic places. James smiled, then forgot about the comment until later that night, when he passed Clara's staff file on his desk. He hadn't opened it in months. Out of curiosity more than anything, he flipped through it. Born in Queens, bachelor's in early childhood education, no criminal record. Volunteered at a women's shelter in college. References glowing but all vague about her personal life. No social media presence, nothing unusual, but also nothing revealing. He hesitated, then did something entirely out of character. The next evening, James wrapped up early, pulled on a hoodie, and slipped behind the wheel of his car. He parked just beyond the estate gates and waited. At exactly 6:02 p.m., Clara emerged, drained boots this time, an old duffel bag slung over one shoulder. No umbrella, no phone in hand. Just that same calm expression. She got into her car and pulled away. James waited a beat, then followed. They drove for nearly 30 minutes. Deeper into the city, past strip malls and laundromats, into a neighborhood James hadn't visited in years. The streetlights flickered. Potholes slowed the ride. Eventually, Clara parked behind a faded brick building with peeling paint. Above the door hung a crooked sign, Safe Haven Outreach Center. James stayed in his car, watching from a distance. Clara disappeared inside. A few minutes later, he cautiously followed on foot and peeked through one of the grimy windows. What he saw stunned him. The room was warm but crowded. Dozens of people, young children, mothers, elderly men sat on old couches and cots. Clara was at the center of it, her coat off, apron on. She served soup, offered blankets, knelt down to hug a crying child. Her face radiated peace. She wasn't just volunteering, she belonged. James felt a wave of something he hadn't experienced in a long time: shame, then wonder, then admiration. The next night, he followed her again. Same routine. This time, he got out of his car, entered the shelter, and quietly observed from the back. No one paid him much attention. Clara never looked his way. Over the next few days, he learned more. That Clara bought the food with her own money, that she taught English to immigrant women there twice a week, that every Wednesday she delivered leftovers to a nearby orphanage, that she'd once turned down a higher-paying job because it conflicted with her shelter hours. He also learned that the shelter was on the brink of losing funding. On Friday evening, as Clara prepared a tray of food, James approached her for the first time. "You never told me you moonlight as a superhero," he said gently. Clara froze, surprised. "Mr. Alcott, what are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing." She lowered her gaze. "It's just ... something I do." "I didn't think it was relevant to the job." "Why not?" James asked. She hesitated. "I didn't want to make it seem like I needed anything from you or that I wasn't fully committed to Emma." James looked around at the worn furniture, the leaky ceiling, faces filled with gratitude. "I think you're more committed to life than most people I know," he said softly. Clara offered a small, shy smile. "This place saved me once. I just try to return the favor." That night, James drove home in silence. But this time, it wasn't the silence of grief. It was the silence of transformation. Something had changed. Not just the way he saw Clara, but the way he saw the world and himself. She, a woman of modest means, had given more of herself than he, with all his millions, ever had. That night, sat beside his daughter as she slept, brushed a curl from her forehead and whispered, "You're lucky to have her." But he knew now they both were. The following week, James Alcott couldn't focus on a single board meeting, contract proposal, or investor call. Something inside him had shifted, slowly but permanently. Clara's world, the one filled with chipped soup bowls, shivering children, and selfless giving, had slipped into his mind like a whisper that refused to leave. He had stepped into her life for a single evening and come away with a weight he didn't know he could carry. Awareness. He had spent the last few years protecting himself from the sharp edges of the world, had buried himself in mergers and acquisitions, in market forecasts and quarterly goals, convincing himself that surviving was enough. But now, for the first time in a long time, he felt like living, really living. The kind of living that didn't come with applause or profit margins, but purpose. On Monday morning, James surprised Clara by waiting for her in the kitchen with a pot of coffee and 2 mugs. She stopped short when she saw him. "Mr. Alcott, call me James," he said, pouring her a cup. "We're not at the office." She looked around nervously. "I didn't think I was late." "You're not. Sit." She hesitated, then took the seat across from him, hands wrapped around the warm mug. "I visited the shelter again this weekend," he said. Clara stiffened slightly. "I hope you weren't uncomfortable. I know it's not exactly a 5-star experience." "It was more real than any gala I've attended," James replied. "More honest than most meetings I've had. And it left me with questions." Clara waited. James leaned in. "Why haven't you ever said anything about what you do, about what the shelter needs?" Clara glanced down at the table. "Because I didn't want to blur the lines. I'm here for Emma, not for donations or favors. But you're doing all this without help, Clara. You spend your evenings giving everything to people who have nothing. That's not just impressive, it's heroic." Clara shook her head. "It's just what feels right." James studied her, realizing how rare she was, not just because she gave, but because she gave quietly. In a world where so many shouted their goodness from rooftops for social media applause, Clara whispered hers into the dark corners where it mattered. Later that day, he made some quiet calls of his own. By the end of the week, the Safe Haven Outreach Center had a new, anonymous benefactor. Their rent was paid for the next 2 years. New mattresses were delivered. The plumbing was fixed. Medical supplies arrived in boxes. Clara knew, of course. She wasn't naive. She didn't say a word until the email came. one of the board. Members at the shelter had traced the donation to a subsidiary owned by Alcott Ventures. Rumors began swirling, especially after someone snapped a photo of James standing outside the shelter during his third visit by Friday. The press had picked up the story. Billionaire CEO funds underground shelter. Sources say it was his daughters Nanny who inspired the gift. James hadn't meant for it to become public, but in the age of clicks and camera phones, privacy was a myth. That afternoon, Clara approached him in the study, holding her phone, clearly rattled. "James, this article. It's everywhere." "No," he said, putting his laptop aside. "I'm sorry, I tried to keep it discreet." She looked torn between gratitude and panic. "This could get me fired. I never meant to drag your name into anything." "I've put Emma at risk." James stood up. "You've done the opposite. You've shown my daughter and me what it means to care without expecting a return." Clara's voice wavered. "But what about the board? Your reputation?" James gave a small smile. "What good is a reputation if it hides who I really want to be?" She didn't have a response for that. Over the next 2 weeks, the story continued to spread. But instead of scandal, it sparked something else. Offers poured into the shelter. Food trucks, volunteered meals. Local doctors offered pro bono checkups. Schools donated books and art supplies. Every night, the line outside the shelter grew longer. People had begun to hope again. Emma, too, began asking more questions. "Can I go help Ms. Clara after school? Can I give some of my toys to the kids?" James felt pride swell in his chest. Not for his wealth or philanthropy. For the little girl who was learning compassion at such a young age. And then came the backlash. Not from the public, but from his own company. During a quarterly strategy meeting, the board voiced their concerns. "You're being reckless," one partner said. "You're aligning the company with causes that don't show immediate ROI. Giving this shelter millions while our international division is laying people off makes us look inconsistent," another chimed in. "This isn't personal, James, but you're turning your grief into a brand. It's risky." James sat quietly, fingers steepled. Then he stood and walked to the glass wall of the conference room, staring out at the city. "I understand your concerns," he said calmly. "But let me be clear. I didn't start this company to make investors. Feel safe. I built it to create things that improve people's lives. If that includes shelters and hungry children, then so be it. If we lose partners because of that, I'm okay with it." There was stunned silence. "I've lived in the shadows of loss long enough. I'm ready to do something that feels real." The board didn't argue further, but the message was clear. He was walking a tightrope. That night, James confided in Clara. "I might lose some partnerships. Maybe even some staff." Clara looked genuinely troubled. "I never wanted to be the reason you faced consequences." "You're not," he said. "You're the reason I remembered I still have a heart." Then he pulled out a folder and handed it to her. "What's this?" "A foundation in Isabel's name, to fund shelters like Safe Haven all across the country. I want you to help run it." Clara's hand trembled as she opened the file. "James, I'm just a nanny." "No," he said. "You're the reason I believe again. I don't need a boardroom full of suits. I need people like you who still see the forgotten. Please, let me do this. Let us do this." Clara's eyes welled up. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything." 6 months later, the Isabel Grace Foundation had opened its third shelter in Detroit. The first was still Safe Haven. Now upgraded and fully staffed, the second in Philadelphia had been founded in partnership with a women's employment center. Clara worked with the foundation 3 days a week and stayed on as Emma's nanny, the other 4. Emma, now 8. Helped pack care kits on weekends and insisted every child in the shelters get a cupcake on their birthday. James still attended. Board meetings still ran the company. But something had changed in him. He smiled more, listened more. He spoke at charity events not to win favor, but to move hearts. And he found himself looking at Clara differently, not with romantic impulse, but with reverence. One evening, as they watched Emma perform her puppet show for a room full of laughing, sheltered children, James leaned over and whispered, I used to think the world needed saving with big money. And now? Clara asked. Now I know the world is saved one act of quiet compassion at a time. You taught me that. She smiled, her eyes warm. You just needed someone to remind you of who you already were. James turned his gaze back. To the children, their laughter echoing through the room like music. For the first time since Isabel's death, he felt whole. Not because he had built something grand, but because he had helped someone rebuild something precious, hope.